Drink up, honey.
Every night for 30 days, she made him tea. And every night for 30 days, he switched the cups. She never knew until the night everything unraveled. This is not a story about poison. This is a story about a marriage and what lives inside one when the trust is already dead. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to question everything you think you know about the person sleeping next to you. You are going to sit with a story that does not have a clean villain, a story that does not have a simple answer, a story where two people who once stood at an altar and meant every word and slowly became strangers under the same roof. And then something far worse than strangers. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a house when a marriage is dying. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of rest. Why, it is the silence of two people who have stopped trying to reach each other and have started instead to reach for other things: control, secrets, power. And in some cases, the kind that end up documented in court records and whispered about in neighborhoods for years, that reaching turns into something that cannot be undone. What you are about to hear is based on documented real events. Names and identifying details have been changed to protect the individuals involved. But the facts are real. The behavior is real. The heartbreak is real. And if you have ever been in a long marriage, if you have ever felt the slow erosion of closeness with someone you once loved completely, some part of what you are about to hear is going to feel uncomfortably familiar. Not because you have done what these people did, but because you will recognize the emptiness that came before it, the silence before the storm, the distance before the decision. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We would love to know. And if this is your first time here on Story Cortex, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the stories we tell here, they are not the kind you forget. They're not the kind that leave you the same. And this one in particular starts with something as ordinary as a cup of tea. Two cups, side by side on a kitchen counter, steam rising in the quiet of an evening. One made with care, one made with something more, and a husband sitting across the room, watching, waiting. Akona knowing exactly what was in his cup and saying nothing for 30 nights. Now ask yourself this: what kind of person watches their spouse do something like that, night after night, and says absolutely nothing? What are they waiting for? What are they building toward? And more importantly, what were they hiding themselves? Because here's the thing about this story that none of the headlines ever quite captured. Both people in this kitchen had a secret. Both of them were carrying something the other one didn't know. And both of those secrets, when they finally came to the surface, would tear apart not just a marriage, but everything those two people thought they knew about themselves. This is the story of Margaret and Thomas. Married 23 years, a home in the Midwest, two grown children, a dog, a life that looked, sure, from every angle that mattered to the outside world, like a quiet American success story. And behind that front door, a level of loneliness so complete, so consuming, that one of them eventually decided that doing something covert, something secret, something that required deception night after night, was somehow better than just having one honest conversation. That detail alone should stop you, because it says something about what happens to people inside long, silent marriages. Something that no therapist on a talk show and no self-help book on a nightstand ever quite prepares you for. When communication dies, truly dies, people do not simply sit in the silence. They find other ways to feel something, other ways to feel present, other ways to feel like they still matter in the life of the person they are losing. And some people have affairs. Some people drink. Some people throw themselves into work or hobbies or friendships that fill the space their marriage used to occupy. And some people, a small, heartbreaking few, reach for control. Because control, when everything else has slipped away, feels like the last thing you can hold on to. Margaret reached for control, and Thomas, when he found out, did not put it down. He picked it up himself and used it differently. That is where this story begins. Not with a crime, not with a villain, but with a kitchen, 2 cups, and 30 nights of silence that changed everything. Before we get into what happened, let us talk about what was really going on inside that house. Because this was not a random act. This was not a crime of passion. This was calculated, patient, and somehow, so both of them thought they were winning. That detail alone should give you pause. Because when two people inside the same marriage both believe they are the one with the upper hand, what you are really looking at is not a marriage at all. What you are looking at is a war fought in the evenings over cups of tea, a war fought in the silences between sentences, a war that neither David nor Claire ever officially declared, but that both of them had been fighting in their own way for a very long time. And wars like that, the ones with no front lines and no uniforms, are almost always the most destructive kind. And here are the 3 questions at the center of this story. Why was Claire putting something in David's tea every single night? How did David find out, and why, knowing what he knew? Boy, did he say absolutely nothing for an entire month? And when the truth finally came out, when everything that had been hidden inside that house was dragged into the light, who was really the victim in this marriage? 3 questions. And the answer to each one is going to shift the way you see this story completely. Because on the surface, this looks like a story about a wife who did something wrong and a husband who caught her doing it. That is the version that spread on social media. That is the version that got people angry. But the full story, the one we are going to tell right here, is something far more layered, far more uncomfortable, and far more human than any headline was willing to admit. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments right now where in the world you are watching from. Yeah, we would love to hear from you. And if you are not already subscribed to Story Cortex, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the stories we tell here are not the kind that leave you where they found you. Now let us go back to the beginning. Not to the night of the confrontation, not to the 30 days of the cup swap, but further back than that. Back to the 2 people who became David and Claire. Back to who they were before the silence took over, before the distance set in, before the kitchen became a place where 2 people performed a life they had quietly stopped believing in. Because to understand what happened in that house, you have to understand who lived there. David was 52 years old, a project manager living just outside Columbus, Ohio. Ishun, the kind of man that coworkers described as the backbone of any team he was placed on. Steady, they said. Reliable. The guy who remembered everyone's birthday, who never raised his voice in a meeting even when he had every right to, who stayed late not because he had to, but because he genuinely cared about whether the job was done right. His neighbors knew him as the man who shoveled their driveways without being asked in the winter. His kids knew him as the dad who showed up. Every game, every recital, every single school drop-off for 13 years. By every outward measure that the world tends to use when measuring a man's life, David had built something solid, something real, something worth being proud of. But David had not slept properly in almost 2 years. And the man who showed up to every meeting, every game, when every driveway was running on empty in a way that nobody around him fully understood. He had gone to his doctor about it. He described the fatigue in the way that men of his generation often do when they are struggling, which is to say he minimized it. He said he was tired, a little foggy, like his mind was wrapped in cotton wool some mornings. The doctor ran a full panel, blood work, thyroid levels, sleep apnea screening. Everything came back normal. The doctor suggested stress management, maybe cut back on caffeine. David nodded, took the pamphlet, and drove home. And sitting in his car in the driveway that afternoon, not quite ready to go inside, he knew that no blood test was going to find what was wrong with him. Because what was wrong with him was not in his blood, it was in his conscience. It was in the 18 months of something he had never spoken out loud to a single person. Something he carried into that house every evening and set down quietly beside his keys and his wallet. He just was not ready to admit it yet. Claire was 49 years old. She had spent nearly a decade as a school administrator in the Columbus area, the kind of role that demands precision, patience, and the ability to hold an entire institution together while making it look effortless. People who worked with her described her the same way, almost word for word: sharp, organized, fiercely dedicated, the person you wanted in charge when things got complicated. She had left that job 3 years before this story reaches its breaking point to work from home, a decision that made practical sense at the time, but that in hindsight, Honoré removed from her life the one daily structure that had been keeping her afloat. Because at work, Claire had purpose, momentum, and identity. At home, in a house that had grown quieter with every passing year, she had a lot of time to notice what was missing. And what was missing was David. Not the man in the house, the man who came home, sat at the table, watched television, and went to bed. She had that version of David. What she had lost was the version that looked at her like she was the most important person in any room. People who knew Claire in those years described her in two very different ways depending on how well they actually knew her. Acquaintances said she seemed fine, a little quieter than she used to be maybe, but fine. Her close friends, the ones she trusted enough to be honest with, told a different story. They described a woman who was privately carrying an enormous weight, a woman who had tried, genuinely and repeatedly tried, to reach her husband. Therapy, which David attended for 3 sessions before deciding it was not for him. Date nights, which became dinners where they talked about the kids, the mortgage, the neighbor's new car, anything except the growing distance between them. Conversations about the future, which David consistently redirected into arguments about the past. Claire had not given up on her marriage. She had not stopped loving David. She had simply gradually run completely out of ideas for how to reach him. And when a person runs out of ideas, when every door they try is locked, they sometimes reach for something that was never theirs to reach for. What she did next was not the act of a monster, it was the act of a desperate woman backed against a wall. Or at least, that is one way to see it. Here is what both David and Claire agreed on. When it was all finally over and the attorneys had finished and the paperwork was signed and there was nothing left between them but the truth, they had once been genuinely, completely, and deeply in love. Not the comfortable kind of love that settles in after years of familiarity. The real kind. The early kind. The where you think about the other person constantly and cannot quite believe your luck that they chose you. They had met in their late 20s at a friend's cookout in the summer of a year when both of them were exactly ready for something real. They married 2 years later. They had 2 children, both now away at college in different states. They had a dog named Biscuit, a brown and white beagle who had no interest in anyone's marital problems and simply wanted to be walked and fed on schedule. They had a house that they had renovated together, a kitchen they had designed together, a life that had been built together, brick by brick, choice by choice, year by year. And somewhere in the middle of all that building, they had lost the thing that made the building feel worth it. Not all at once. That is never how it happens. Not it happened the way most slow losses happen, gradually, quietly, in the spaces between moments that were too small to notice in real time. A conversation cut short, a question not asked, a moment of tenderness that one of them reached for and the other one missed entirely. Multiply that by 1,000 evenings over 23 years, and what you get is not a marriage that exploded. You get a marriage that simply went cold. The tea ritual had started innocently enough. Every evening after dinner, Claire made herbal tea for both of them. It was one of the last things they still did together at the end of the day, sitting at the kitchen table with their cups, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in the same space without needing to fill it. It was small, but it was something. And then one night, Claire added something extra to David's cup, something she had not told him about. And David, who noticed almost immediately, never said a single word. For 30 days, he let her believe it was working. Before your mind goes to the darkest place, and given the title of this story, that is a natural place for your mind to go. Let us be precise about what we are talking about here. Claire was not trying to poison her husband. She was not trying to harm him, sedate him into a stupor, or incapacitate him in any way that carried serious medical risk. What she added to David's tea was a combination of over-the-counter supplements. Valerian root, which has been used as a mild sleep aid for centuries, and is sold freely in every drugstore in America. Passion flower extract, another common herbal sedative used for anxiety and restlessness. And melatonin, the sleep hormone that millions of Americans take nightly. Though in David's cup, Claire used roughly double the standard dose. None of these substances would have shown up on a standard toxicology screen. None of them would have sent anyone to an emergency room. They were not prescription medications. They were not controlled substances. They were the kind of thing you could buy on any pharmacy shelf between the vitamin C and the allergy tablets. That distinction matters, not because it makes what Claire did acceptable, but because it changes the category of what we are dealing with. This was not a poisoning in the criminal sense of that word. This was something more complicated, more ambiguous, and in some ways more troubling, because it lived in the gray space where intention and action do not quite line up. Claire's reasoning, which she would later lay out in painful and detailed honesty during legal proceedings, was heartbreaking in its logic. David had become increasingly withdrawn over the previous 2 years, irritable, unable to relax in the evenings. She had watched him come home from work wound tight with a tension he could not or would not name, snapping at small things, barely present even when he was sitting right there. She believed, and this was her genuine belief, that if he could just sleep properly, just settle into some kind of rest, just calm down enough for the two of them to reconnect, maybe there was still something left to save. She was not trying to harm him. She was trying to fix him without his knowledge, without his consent. And that distinction between a good intention and an act of control, Nasser, is at the very heart of everything this story asks of you. It is worth sitting with that for a moment because it is the detail that split public opinion on this case right down the middle. On one side, it does not matter why Claire did it. Administering any substance to another person, even a harmless supplement, without their knowledge or consent is a violation of their bodily autonomy. It is a form of control. It is covert. It is wrong. Full stop, no asterisks, no qualifications. On the other side, context matters. Desperation is real. People in failing marriages sometimes reach for things they should not reach for. And the difference between a predator and a desperate person is not always visible from the outside. And on a third side, the side that made people the most uncomfortable. What does it say about the state of a marriage when one partner feels that secretly altering the other person's chemistry is a more realistic option than simply having a direct and honest conversation? That is the question that does not go away. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when David first made his move. Not the Tuesday of the confrontation. That comes later. This was the Tuesday 3 weeks earlier when he found the supplements tucked under the bathroom sink, behind the cleaning products, in a space where they had no logical reason to be. No receipt nearby, no box in the recycling, just the bottles, half used, pushed to the back like something that was meant to stay out of sight. David picked them up, read the labels, put them back exactly as he had found them, and then walked out of that bathroom without changing his expression. He did not confront Claire that evening. He did not mention it at dinner. He sat at the kitchen table, accepted the cup of tea she placed in front of him, and while she was not looking, he poured it into the plant on the windowsill. He had been doing this for 3 weeks by the time he began the recordings, and he had been doing it so naturally, so casually, that Claire never suspected a thing. Think about the kind of composure that requires, the kind of internal calculation. David was not a man who acted without thinking. He had always been methodical, the project manager in him running even when he was not at work, organizing variables, identifying risks, planning responses. When he found those bottles, he did not reach for his phone to call a lawyer or a doctor or even a friend. He reached for a plan. He needed to understand the full shape of what was happening before he decided what to do about it. And so he watched. He observed. He waited. He began recording the evenings on his phone, positioned carefully on the kitchen counter, capturing what happened in the moments before she carried the cups to the table. And every evening, he watched Claire add something to his cup. And every evening, he swapped the cups when she was not looking. And every evening, he performed the drowsiness that the supplements would have produced if he had actually been drinking them. He went to bed early. He slept in on weekends. He yawned at the dinner table. He gave her the evidence of effectiveness that kept her from stopping or changing course. He set a trap. And for 30 nights, Claire walked straight into it. What David was doing in those 30 days is something that legal experts would later argue about at considerable length. Was it evidence gathering? Was it manipulation? Was it entrapment in the colloquial sense, even if not the legal one? These are not easy questions. Because from one angle, David was a man who had discovered that his wife was secretly putting substances in his drink, and he wanted documented proof before making any accusation. That is understandable. That is reasonable. But from another angle, David extended the situation deliberately for 4 full weeks when he had more than enough evidence by day 5 or 6 to confront Claire or go to the police. He chose not to. He kept going. And that choice, that particular decision to wait and watch and record for 30 consecutive nights rather than 14 or 10 or 5, would become one of the most scrutinized decisions in the entire legal proceeding. He did not confront Claire. He did not call a doctor. He did not call a friend. He set a trap. And then he sat inside that marriage, inside that kitchen, inside those 30 evenings of performed normalcy, and he waited. Think about what that month must have looked like from the inside for both of them. For Claire, it was 30 evenings of quiet hope. She had been watching David closely, the way you watch someone you are afraid of losing, measuring small things. Was he less irritable? Was he sleeping better? Was there any sign, any small and fragile signal, that the distance between them was closing even slightly? And there were signs, because David was giving them to her deliberately. He was going to bed earlier. He seemed calmer at the dinner table. He was engaging with her a little more in the evenings before claiming tiredness and turning in. From Claire's perspective, whatever she was doing was working. She did not know the calm was performed. She did not know the drowsiness was theater. She did not know that the man sitting across from her at that kitchen table every evening knew exactly what she was doing and had known for a month. She was watching the results of her own plan take shape, unaware that the results were entirely fabricated by the person she was trying to reach. And for David, those 30 evenings were something entirely different. Every night was a choice to maintain the performance, to keep swapping the cups, to keep recording, us to keep watching. Every night was a decision not to speak. And sitting inside that decision, night after night, carrying what he knew while carrying everything else he was carrying, must have produced a kind of interior tension that is difficult to describe from the outside. He knew about the supplements. Claire did not know that he knew. He was recording her. She had no idea. And beneath all of that, buried under the surveillance and the cup swapping and the performance of a man being slowly sedated, was the 18 months of guilt that we will come to shortly. The thing David had not told anyone. The thing that was the actual reason he had not been sleeping. 2 people. Same kitchen, same table, same cups. Completely different realities unfolding in the same room every single evening for a month. And then, on day 30, David made a decision. He stopped swapping the cups. He picked up the one Claire had prepared for him, the one with the supplements she had been adding every night, and he drank it, all of it. And then he set the cup down on the table, looked across at Claire and said 4 words. Words he had been waiting 30 days to say. Words she would replay in her mind for the rest of that year. He said, I know what you've done. What happened in that kitchen in the minutes after David spoke? Those 4 words has been described differently by both people involved, and that difference is itself telling. David's account is detailed and specific in the way that someone's account tends to be when they have been preparing for a moment for a long time. He says Claire went pale almost immediately, that she started to deny it. The reflexive denial of someone caught completely off guard before her eyes moved to his phone on the table, and something in her face changed. That when he turned the screen toward her and she understood what she was seeing, 30 days of recorded footage of her preparing his tea, her hands in his cup, her additions to his drink, she stopped speaking entirely. And then slowly she slid from her chair and sat down on the kitchen floor. Not dramatically, not as a collapse, more like someone whose legs simply decided the news was too heavy to hold. She sat on that floor for a long time, and David, by his own account, did not move to comfort her. He sat in his chair, at his table, and waited. Claire's account of the same moment is different in one significant detail. She remembers going pale, yes. She remembers the denial. Why, she remembers seeing the phone. But the feeling she describes in the immediate aftermath of hearing those four words is not what you might expect. She says her first feeling was not guilt. It was not shame. It was not fear, though all of those came later. Her first feeling in the first few seconds after David said, "I know what you've done," was relief, a physical, almost overwhelming sense of relief. Because at least now, for the first time in as long as she could remember, someone was paying attention. The things she had been doing in secret, the things she had been carrying alone, the desperation that had driven her to it, all of it was suddenly visible. And being visible, even in the worst possible way, felt better than the invisibility she'd been living in for years. That single detail, Claire's relief at being caught, is the detail that reframes this entire story, because it tells you that what Claire had been suffering from inside that marriage was not only frustration or unhappiness, it was erasure. She had become someone who did not feel seen by the person who was supposed to see her most. And the only way she had found to feel like she was still part of his life was to change his chemistry without his knowledge. That is not a story about a predator. That is a story about a woman who had run so far past the end of her rope that she could not even see the rope anymore. David did not call the police that night. His first call, made from the garage while Claire was still sitting somewhere in the house behind a closed door, was to his brother. His brother, a man we will call Marcus, is a straight-talking former military man who had never had much patience for complicated emotional situations. Marcus's advice was immediate and uncomplicated.
Get out of the house tonight, document everything, do not say another word to her without a lawyer present.
It was the advice of a man who saw the situation as simple. His brother's wife had been drugging him. That was a crime. The appropriate response was to treat it like one. David listened to Marcus, and then he stayed in the house anyway. That decision, staying, is one that people who followed this case later had a great deal of difficulty understanding. His brother told him to leave. He had 30 days of documented evidence of something that carried genuine legal weight. He had every reason and every practical justification to walk out of that house that night and let the legal process take over. He stayed. And the question of why David stayed, why he chose to remain inside the house with the woman he had just confronted, sleeping in a separate room but under the same roof, is a question that gets to something important about who David actually was in this marriage. For 11 days after that confrontation, David and Claire shared that house in a silence that their children, their friends, and their neighbors had no knowledge of whatsoever. They slept in separate rooms. They spoke only when logistics required it. The breakfast table, which had always been a quiet place in their marriage, became a place where two people moved around each other like furniture, careful not to make contact, careful not to start anything. From the outside, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. The lawn was mowed, the mail was collected, Biscuit was walked every morning. The performance of ordinary life continued in every visible way, while behind the front door, something was being built that could not be unbuilt. David was building a case. He was organizing his documentation, adding to his journal, consulting quietly online about his legal options. Claire was building something too, though what exactly she was constructing in those 11 days was not immediately apparent to anyone, including David. Neither of their children knew. None of their friends suspected. The neighbors had no idea. The house was silent in the way that houses get silent when the people inside them have stopped pretending to each other but have not yet stopped pretending to everyone else. Until Claire made a phone call that changed everything. On the 11th day, Claire called a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer. And that detail is important. A criminal defense attorney. She found the name through an online search, made the call from her home office with the door closed, and spoke for 40 minutes. The choice of a criminal defense attorney rather than a divorce attorney tells you precisely where Claire's head was on day 11. She was not thinking about the marriage anymore. She was not thinking about reconciliation or mediation or any of the things she had been thinking about for the previous 4 years. Come, she was thinking about legal exposure. She was thinking about what 30 days of documented footage of her adding supplements to her husband's drink without his consent might mean in a courtroom. She was thinking about herself. And that was the moment this situation stopped being a private marital crisis and became something that was going to require the kind of resolution that involves attorneys and filings and public records. When David found out that Claire had retained a criminal defense attorney, and he found out because Claire told him directly in the kitchen on the 12th day, that was when he finally called the police. He filed a report that same afternoon. He documented 30 consecutive days of what he described as covert supplementation without consent. He submitted the video footage from his phone, which was, as Marcus had advised, extensive and detailed. He submitted the journal he had been keeping since the night he found the bottles under the sink, a handwritten record of daily entries with timestamps, descriptions of the supplements he had identified, notes on the symptoms he had researched, observations about Claire's behavior during the preparation of the tea each evening. The investigating officer who reviewed the documentation described it in notes that would later be referenced in proceedings as unusually organized. David had not approached this like a husband who had discovered something terrible and was acting on shock and hurt. He had approached it like a man who had known something was coming and had spent 30 days making sure he was prepared for it. David had been thorough, almost unnervingly thorough. And that thoroughness, much the very thing that made his case compelling, would become its own kind of question mark before this was all over. When fragments of this story began circulating on social media, which they inevitably did once the police report became part of a discoverable public record, the reaction was both swift and deeply divided in ways that revealed as much about the people reacting as they did about David and Claire. The first camp, and it was a large and vocal one, said this was simple. Claire had administered substances to her husband without his knowledge or consent. It did not matter that the substances were herbal. It did not matter that she believed she was helping him. Covert drugging is covert drugging. Mike, and the law in most American states does not distinguish between harmful and harmless intent when it comes to administering anything to another person without their consent. This camp was not interested in nuance. They had a point, one that is not easy to argue with on strictly legal terms. The second camp, quieter but persistent, pointed at David. They noted that a man who watches his spouse covertly add something to his drink for 30 consecutive nights while secretly recording her is not behaving like a victim seeking safety. He is behaving like someone conducting a covert operation. He had the footage he needed to go to the police within the first week. He chose to extend the situation by 3 additional weeks. He chose to stay in the house after the confrontation rather than remove himself from what he had characterized as an unsafe environment. He could have confronted Claire on day 1 or day 5 or day 10. He did not. Why? That question did not sit quietly. And then there was a third camp, smaller, less vocal, but in many ways the most interesting. Mostly made up of people who had been in long, difficult marriages, people in the 45 to 65 age range who recognized something in this story they wish they did not recognize. They said, I understand how both of them got here. Not that either of them was right, not that either of them was justified, but that they understood the path that led to this kitchen, this table, these 2 cups. And that understanding terrified them because there was a third secret inside that house. And it belonged to David. And when it came to light, it changed the shape of everything. Remember when we established that David had not slept properly in almost 2 years? Remember the doctor's appointments and the blood panels and the normal results and the pamphlet about stress management? Here is what David had not told his doctor, what he had not told Marcus, what he had not told a single living person in the 18 months before that October kitchen confrontation. For a year and a half, David had been involved in an emotional affair. He was insistent during legal proceedings and in conversations with his attorney on the specific language. Emotional, not physical, he said. He had never met the woman in person after the initial meeting. There had been no hotel rooms, no secret weekends, and nothing that crossed into the physical territory he seemed to need very much to stay on the other side of. But what there had been was a daily, intimate, consuming connection with a woman he had met at a work conference in Denver. Text messages that ran for hours, phone calls during his commute, a level of emotional honesty and vulnerability with a stranger that he had not been able to access with his own wife in years. The guilt was eating him alive, and the sleeplessness that Claire had attributed to stress that his doctor had found no medical cause for, that had convinced Claire that David needed to be chemically relaxed. That sleeplessness was his conscience keeping him awake every night. Here is the brutal and almost unbearable irony at the center of this story. Claire had been secretly sedating her husband for 30 nights because she believed his emotional distance and his restlessness were the symptoms of a sleep problem she could fix. But the sleep problem was not a sleep problem. The emotional distance was not a mood disorder. It was guilt. It was the weight of an 18-month secret. It was the particular and exhausting work of being one person to your wife and an entirely different person to someone else every single day for a year and a half. Claire was trying to fix a symptom she had completely misdiagnosed because she did not know, could not have known what was actually causing it. She had been reaching toward a husband who was already somewhere else, trying to reconnect with a man who had built an entire emotional life in another direction. And he had let her reach, in knowing she would never quite get there, saying nothing while secretly recording her, while carrying a secret that made his hands just as unclean as hers. Not in the same way, not in the same legal category, but in the court of something older and more honest than any legal proceeding, in the court of what two people owe each other inside a marriage. David's hands were not clean either. When David's emotional affair came to light during the discovery phase of the legal proceedings, Claire's attorney moved quickly to use it. Not as a defense exactly, because in legal terms, the affair did not change the fundamental nature of what Claire had done, but as a reframing, an argument about context, about the full picture, about what kind of marriage these two people were actually living in. And then Claire's attorney raised a second argument, and one that generated significant discussion in legal circles covering the case. The argument was this: David's 30 days of covert recording inside a shared marital residence potentially constituted a violation of wiretapping and two-party consent statutes under their state's law. The attorney argued that David had not behaved like a victim. Victims seek help. Victims remove themselves from harm. Victims go to the police or a doctor or a trusted person and say, "Something is wrong, I need help." David had done none of those things. Instead, he had set up a covert surveillance operation inside a shared home over a period of 30 days. He had deliberately extended and continued a situation he was fully aware of rather than ending or reporting it. He had, in the attorney's framing, acted like an investigator. And investigators are held to different standards than victims. The prosecution's response was measured but firm. A victim does not forfeit their right to document their own victimization simply because they are methodical about it. The fact that David was organized and deliberate in gathering evidence does not transform him from a victim into a perpetrator. People who are being wronged are allowed to protect themselves. They are allowed to build a case. They are allowed to want evidence before they make an accusation that could have serious consequences for another person. The prosecution also noted that the supplements, while legally available, were being administered covertly and without consent on a nightly basis, and that the intent, however well-meaning Claire claimed it to be, did not remove the legal significance of the act. The judge assigned to the case was a woman with 24 years on the bench. She was known by attorneys who had appeared before her as someone who read every document herself and took her time. She took 4 days to rule on the preliminary motions. And when her ruling came, it surprised people on both sides of the case. The covert recordings were admissible. The judge ruled that David's documentation of his own kitchen in a shared residence, where he had as much legal right to be as Claire did, fell within the boundaries of personal documentation and did not constitute illegal surveillance under the applicable statutes. The footage stood, the journal stood, the police report and its supporting materials stood. On the question of the criminal charge against Claire, specifically the administration of substances without consent, so that the case was allowed to proceed. That was one half of the ruling. The other half was quieter, but arguably more significant in its long-term consequences. The judge issued a separate ruling regarding the civil proceedings, the divorce that was already being filed simultaneously. She ruled that David's deliberate 30-day extension of the surveillance, his documented decision to continue covertly recording and swapping cups for nearly 3 additional weeks after he had sufficient evidence to act, would be considered by the court in assessing the distribution of assets, liabilities, and terms in the divorce settlement. She did not call it manipulation in the ruling. She did not use language that dramatic, but what she communicated was clear enough. And both of these people had conducted themselves in ways that the court intended to take seriously. Neither of them had simply been wronged. Both of them had made choices that the legal process was now going to weigh. Claire faced potential criminal exposure for 30 consecutive nights of covert supplementation without consent. David faced significant financial and civil liability in the divorce for his month of deliberate, documented deception. Neither of them won. Both of them lost. And that outcome, as uncomfortable as it was for everyone involved, felt in some deep and honest way exactly proportionate to what had actually happened inside that house. Not because the law got everything right. The law rarely gets everything right when it enters the complicated interior of a human relationship, but because the shape of the consequence matched the shape of the situation. Two people, both carrying secrets, both reaching for control, both convinced in their own way that they were justified, and both discovering in the end that justification does not protect you from consequences. During Claire's formal deposition, her attorney asked her a question that had been carefully constructed in advance. The kind of question that legal strategy sometimes produces, one designed to elicit a specific kind of answer that serves a specific kind of purpose. The question was simple. Did you believe that what you were doing was helping your husband? It was supposed to be the setup for a compassionate narrative. Claire paused for a long time before she answered. Not the theatrical pause of someone performing their answer, the real pause of someone deciding whether to give the rehearsed version or the true one. And then she said something that her own attorney had not anticipated. She said no, not really. What she said in full was this. She said she thought she had been doing it to help David. She had told herself that. Otherwise, she had believed it, at least in the beginning. But somewhere in the 30 nights of adding supplements to his cup, she had understood something she could not quite articulate to herself in the moment. She had understood that she was not really doing it for him. She was doing it because it was the only way she could still feel like she was part of his life. The only way she could feel like she still had some kind of effect on him. Even if he did not know it was her doing it. That answer stopped the room. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way that a piece of information stops a room when it is the kind of truth that does not leave once it enters. Because that answer was not the answer of a manipulator. It was not the answer of someone who had calculated harm and proceeded anyway. It was the answer of someone who had been so thoroughly invisible inside her own marriage that she had been willing to do something covert and wrong, not to control her husband, not to harm him, but simply to feel like she still existed in his world. Simply to feel, even in a small and secret and completely unreciprocated way, like she was still doing something for him, still touching his life, still present. The loneliness that produced that answer is the kind that most people never speak about openly, because it is too specific, too intimate, too exposing. The loneliness of being inside a marriage and feeling more alone than you would if you were actually alone. The loneliness of being visible but unseen, present but unfelt. Physically close to someone and emotionally so far away from them that you stop being able to remember what closeness felt like. Claire had been living inside that loneliness for years, and the supplements in the tea were, in the end, less about sedating David and more about Claire reaching, in the only way she had left, to touch a life she felt she was losing. David's admission came during his own deposition, and it was one that his attorney had explicitly counseled him against making. The advice was to keep his answers narrow, specific, and legally protective. David gave narrow and specific answers for most of the deposition. And then he was asked a direct question about the timeline of the surveillance. Specifically, when he was asked when he had determined that he had sufficient evidence to either confront Claire or contact law enforcement, and David answered honestly. He said that by the end of the second week of recording, he had more than enough documentation to take action. The footage was clear, the journal was detailed, the pattern was established beyond any reasonable doubt. He had, by day 14, everything he needed. He kept recording for 16 more days. When asked why, David paused. And then he said something that was not legally strategic and that his attorney visibly reacted to. But that was, by every account of everyone present in that room, the truth. He said that part of him had wanted to see if Claire would stop on her own, that he had kept going because he was waiting for her to decide, on her own, without confrontation, to put the bottles away and go back to just making tea. That every evening he had sat at that table and watched and waited, and she had not stopped, and that her not stopping had told him something about where they were that he had not quite been willing to know before. Think about what that means. David was not continuing the surveillance out of legal strategy alone, though that was part of it. He was continuing it because he was waiting for his wife to choose differently. He was sitting in that kitchen every evening, watching Claire add something to his cup and holding on to a question. Would she stop? Would some internal moral compass activate on its own? Would she look at what she was doing and decide it was wrong without being confronted or caught? And every evening the answer was no. And every evening that no arrived, something in David's understanding of the marriage settled a little more completely into its final shape. Two people at a table, one waiting for the other to be helped, one waiting for the other to stop. Neither of them saying the thing that needed to be said. Neither of them reaching across the actual distance with actual words. Both of them sitting inside their separate secrets, measuring each other from a distance, waiting. Neither of them did the one thing that might have changed the outcome. And somehow, that is the most human part of this entire story. Not the supplements, not the recordings, not the attorneys and the depositions and the rulings, the waiting, the silence, the hope that the other person would change without being asked to. The criminal case against Claire was resolved through a deferred prosecution agreement, which in practical terms meant this. If Claire completed the conditions set by the court over the following 2 years, the charge would not proceed to trial and would not result in a conviction on her permanent record. The conditions were mandatory counseling, a period of supervised probation lasting 24 months, and a formal acknowledgement in writing that administering any substance to another person without their consent, regardless of intent, was a violation of that person's rights. No jail time, no felony conviction. A resolution that people on both sides of the public debate found unsatisfying in different ways, which is often the sign that a legal outcome has landed somewhere close to fair. The divorce was finalized 8 months after the confrontation. The settlement reflected the judge's earlier ruling, out of which meant that David's deliberate month-long extension of the surveillance was factored into the division of assets in a way that cost him more than he had anticipated going in. David ended the emotional affair 6 weeks after the kitchen confrontation. He told his attorney and later a therapist he began seeing privately that the affair had already been diminishing before any of this happened, that the guilt had been too much to sustain, that he had been in the slow process of withdrawing from it when Claire's supplementation came to light. Whether that timing makes the affair more sympathetic or simply more complicated is a question each person listening to this story will answer for themselves. Claire moved to be closer to her sister, who lived in another state. She continued the counseling that the court had mandated, and by all accounts continued it beyond the court's requirement. David stayed in the same house, the one they had renovated together, the kitchen they had designed together, the table where 30 evenings of silent theater had played out over cups of tea. He still has Biscuit. The beagle is apparently doing exactly fine, which is more than can be said for most of the humans in this story. There is a version of this story where Claire is the villain. She administered substances to her husband without his knowledge or consent, night after night for a month. That is a fact. It is wrong. It is a violation. Full stop. There is a version of this story where David is the villain. He conducted 30 nights of covert surveillance of his wife inside their shared home, deliberately extended the situation when he had enough evidence to act. Howdis carried an 18-month emotional affair that was the actual source of the disconnection his wife was trying to fix, and chose patience and documentation over honesty. That is also a fact. That is also wrong. And then there is a third version, maybe the truest one, a version where neither of them is the villain, but both of them failed, where two people loved each other until they did not know how anymore, where the communication that should have carried them through the hard years quietly died, and they both, in their own way, reached for substitutes. Claire reached for control because she had no words left. David reached for distance because the words he was carrying were ones he was too afraid to speak. Different substitutes, both inadequate, both corrosive, both in the end the kind of thing that cannot be undone. You know what the thing about this story is that does not leave you? It did not start with malice. It started with silence. It started with two people who stopped telling each other the truth and then stopped asking each other the questions that might have led back to it. It started long before the tea, long before the supplements, long before the recordings and the attorneys and the depositions. It started at a dinner table, or a couch, or a drive somewhere, when one of them said, "Are you okay?" and the other one said, "Fine." And they both knew it was not fine, and neither of them pushed further. Think about the person you share your life with tonight, the person on the other side of your kitchen table. Think about the last time you really said what you meant, the last time you asked a question and actually waited for the true answer, the last time you were brave enough to say the thing that was hard because the alternative was a silence that grows. Something to sit with. Before you go, there is something we genuinely want to ask you, not as a content prompt, as a real question. After everything you have just heard, after all of it, who do you think carried more responsibility in this marriage? David or Claire? Because every time this story has been shared, the response splits almost exactly down the middle. And we think that split says something important, not about David and Claire specifically, but about how differently we see guilt, intention, and responsibility depending on our own experiences and our own histories. Drop your answer in the comments right now. And more than just David or Claire, tell us why. Tell us what part of this story hit you hardest. Or tell us if you recognized something in it. Because the comments on a story like this one are often as worth reading as the story itself. And we read every single one. We mean that. And if this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own relationships, your own silences, your own secrets, the things you are carrying that the person closest to you does not know, then Story Cortex has done exactly what it was built to do. We are here for the stories that live in the places most channels do not look. The interior spaces, the quiet rooms, the marriages and families and lives that look one way from the outside and feel entirely different from within. That is where we go. That is what we do. If you are not already part of this community, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. Well, because what is coming next is the kind of story that will stay with you for days. A man who spent 41 years living as someone he was not by choice, not by deception of his own making, but because the truth of who he actually was had been hidden from him before he was old enough to ask any questions. A story about identity, about family, about the secrets that get passed down instead of the truth. You are going to want to be here for that one. We will see you then.